Over the past couple of weeks, I've been seeing more and more videos about chemtrails. It feels like every few years this idea comes back up, but this time, it feels a little bit different. Two family members completely independently brought it up to me. And then someone I know posted this video on their story.
What are these lines in the sky that we have all seen?
They're sprayed particulate dispersion. Bottom line is, when we have up-close film footage of these aircraft at altitude with nozzles visible turning dispersions on and off. This elephant in the sky that we are told is a conspiracy theory is exactly what the entire global climate science community says we need to deploy immediately to slow down the warming of the planet.
At this point, I felt the need to actually look into this. I was getting tired of Instagram comment sections where people on both sides were just throwing out conflicting information like they're absolutely certain. I decided I wanted to go down the rabbit hole myself, do some research, quickly see the flaws in the theory, and go about my week. But when I actually started digging, I kinda got why people believe in this theory. The history is all real, a lot of the programs they claim are real, and even the patents they talk about are real. But where it really starts to crumble is what people think it all means. And honestly, what's actually going on is way more interesting. With how much history there is surrounding the chemtrails theory, I think it's worth looking at where this idea actually comes from. I do want to be upfront that a lot of the history backing this theory is real. I'm not trying to sit here and tell you that it's fake. What I want to do is walk through this history honestly and examine what people think it all means, whether that be weather control, population control, or psychological manipulation, and show why these conclusions don't hold up, even if you accept everything I'm about to tell you. In the late 1960s and early 70s, the US military ran a campaign called Project Popeye, where they conducted targeted cloud seeding operations in Vietnam. The hope was to trigger excessive rainfall on supply routes and make them impassable. Then, in 1996, the US Air Force published a report titled Weather as a Force Multiplier, Owning the Weather in 2025. The report proposed that the military could use small-scale weather modification techniques to impede enemies. This included concepts like using nanotechnology to create smart clouds that could disrupt sensors or even generate lightning. And it's worth mentioning that this isn't the only time the military has put something wild on paper. In 1956, they contracted a Canadian company to build a flying saucer that was supposed to go 2,600 miles per hour and hover at 100,000 feet. It topped out at about 35 miles per hour and couldn't get more than 3 feet off the ground. So when people point to the Owning the Weather report as proof that this technology exists, it's worth remembering that the military writes papers about a lot of things. And there's a large gap between what a military report says and what's actually possible. On top of that, chemtrail theorists point to multiple patents that support the idea that the government is deliberately spraying chemicals into the atmosphere. A 1990 patent filed by Hughes Aircraft Company described dispersing metallic oxide particles throughout the stratosphere to reduce global warming. And what probably feeds even more into the conspiracy is that Hughes Aircraft Company is now known as Raytheon, a major defense contractor. So it's truly a fair question to ask what that patent is being used for. But a patent existing doesn't necessarily mean it's being deployed. And more importantly, even if it were, it still doesn't get us to the conclusions that people are drawing. And that's what I really want to dig into. One of the most popular beliefs of those who subscribe to this theory is that chemtrails are being used to control the weather, whether at local scales or larger regional scales. Now, let's be clear. Cloud seeding is absolutely a scientifically feasible technique. What happens is low-flying planes can inject molecules like silver iodide into the low atmosphere, which stimulates precipitation. Silver iodide creates a structure that's very similar to ice, which essentially acts as the foundation for water droplets to form. Then they freeze and they get heavy enough to fall out as snow or rain. By doing this, we're not creating rain or snow. We're essentially dumping seeds into the atmosphere so that extra water droplets can grow beyond what might be expected under normal conditions. It's like having a plot of land where only half is being utilized to grow corn. If we throw seeds onto the other half of the plot, we'll be able to grow more corn under the conditions of the plot. In the atmosphere, we're limited by how much water vapor is already in the area that we're seeding. And in the best case, under perfect atmospheric conditions, cloud seeding might increase precipitation in an area by about 20%. there are physical and natural limits to how effective cloud seeding is. This brings me to a larger point, which is the idea that this weather modification can turn into massive extreme weather events, with the government controlling hurricanes, creating lightning storms, and sending it all to a specific area. To understand this, we need to zoom out a little bit. A single hurricane releases around 600 terawatts of energy. This unit can be a little hard to understand, so to put it in other words, the average hurricane releases energy equivalent to the detonation of about 500,000 Hiroshima bombs per day. A single hurricane produces 3,000 times more energy than the entire world electrical power grid is even capable of. Even if somehow we were dropping hundreds of Hiroshima bombs on an ocean per day and no one noticed, we wouldn't be able to even have a minute effect on the creation or movement of a hurricane. Even if every government on Earth pulled every energy resource they had, they would not be able to produce a single hurricane. So, now when we look back at just the release of particles from a plane, this argument falls flat. Not only is cloud seeding already limited by what's in the atmosphere, but we would also have to provide more energy than the entire world is even capable of producing. If we scale down even a little bit to produce a thunderstorm, we would need the energy of over 10 Hiroshima bombs. Now that we've talked about hurricanes, this number might seem kind of small, but let's not lose sight of how much energy this actually is. And then there's this idea that the government is targeting specific areas with extreme weather. Going back to the corn analogy, you can throw seeds on your plot, but you can't decide exactly which stalks grow where. The atmosphere works the same way. It's chaotic and a fluid system. Even cloud seeding, the most controlled form of weather modification we have, can't guarantee where the rain actually falls. We can nudge precipitation in a general area under ideal conditions, and that's it. I mean, meteorologists can't even perfectly forecast weather 2 days in the future. The idea that someone or some government could aim a hurricane at a specific region assumes a level of atmospheric control that simply does not exist anywhere in science. Now, I've heard of theories where the government is manipulating weather to benefit insurance companies or to target specific communities, but all of those theories require the same thing: the ability to create and direct extreme weather at will. And clearly that ability just does not exist. The other major concerns people have about chemtrails are things like population control, which is the idea that chemicals are being sprayed to poison people, make them sick, and even reduce fertility, and psychological manipulation, where chemicals are thought to alter moods, suppress autonomy of thought, and make people more susceptible to coercement. Here, I want to come back to something we looked at earlier. A lot of believers in this theory identify chemtrails by their specific tendency to spread out in the sky and almost cover the atmosphere in a blanket of particles. This might seem suspicious, but this spreading is actually the strongest argument against both of these theories. When you look up and watch a trail expand and disperse across the sky, what you're seeing is particles of that trail dispersing and diluting into the atmosphere. In this case, it doesn't matter whether the trail is simply just water vapor or if it's actually some special chemical. In reality, when a chemtrail expands and disperses across the sky, it's spreading thinner and thinner across a huge volume of the atmosphere. It can obviously be hard to understand how far away these trails are when they're ejected from a plane, but in most cases they're over 30,000 feet above the ground. At this altitude, even if we granted that chemicals were being released, they wouldn't just fall to the ground. In fact, they would drift around and get caught in wind patterns, mixing throughout the atmosphere over many days before any chemicals might even reach the ground. By the time it would get to the ground, if ever, there's essentially nothing in the air that you're breathing. For scale, these particles would spread out over thousands to potentially tens of thousands of square miles in the atmosphere. So really, if the goal is to control a population through some kind of chemical, then this is probably the worst possible method imaginable. You have no control over how much you're delivering to a person or who you're delivering it to. To even think about having a possibility of humans breathing any of these chemicals, you would have to spray so much that the chemicals would be detectable by almost any weather or air quality monitoring station in the country. At this point, everybody would be breathing these chemicals, including the supposed people who are behind the whole thing. This logic also follows for the theory of psychological manipulation. To have a substance actually alter your brain chemistry, it needs to be delivered in a specific dose, like medicine. If you don't have enough, then it's not going to do anything. The idea that something could be released from commercial flight altitude, disperse across the atmosphere, fall and dilute through tens of thousands of feet of altitude, be inhaled by you, and then be enough to actually alter your brain is virtually impossible. I mean, if we want to talk about psychological manipulation, we need to have a deeper conversation about social media algorithms and social media platforms in general. So really, the answer to these two fears is quite simple. These trails spreading across the sky is precisely why these theories fall short. Dilution and spreading of particles is exactly what you would not want to happen, because it makes delivery of chemicals impossible. Even if I were to grant that these trails are chemicals, the physics of the atmosphere makes what people are afraid of impossible. Now, I do want to address two specific things that come up a lot in this conversation. The first is footage of trails behind planes switching on and off, which people often point to as proof that someone is flipping a nozzle. But what you're actually seeing is a plane flying through air that isn't uniform. The atmosphere has patches of different humidity and temperature, and when a plane passes through a more humid pocket, a trail forms. When it hits drier air, the trail stops. It's not a switch being flipped, it's just the atmosphere not being the same everywhere. The second thing I want to talk about is soil and water testing. One of the most cited pieces of evidence is that soil samples have been taken and found to contain aluminum nanoparticles, which are also named in some of those geoengineering patents I mentioned earlier. And I get why that sounds like a big deal, but aluminum is the third most abundant element in the Earth's crust. It's literally everywhere. You could take a soil sample in your backyard right now and find aluminum. You could take one in the middle of a forest that hasn't ever had a plane fly above it, and you'll find aluminum. Finding it in the environment doesn't really tell you anything about what's coming out of a plane. It just tells you what the Earth is already made out of. Finally, I want to address one more thing. Some people believe that what's being sprayed is specifically meant to modify solar radiation, essentially spraying particles that block sunlight and cool the Earth. This honestly has a really simple answer. If some company or government were doing large-scale solar radiation management, we would know. I mean, the entire point is to reflect sunlight and cool the planet. That would show up clearly in temperature records, with temperatures flattening or going down. Instead, we're continuing to see record-breaking global temperatures year after year. There's simply no indication in the data that some organization is already doing this. And that honestly brings me back to what I've wanted to talk about this entire time. In the clip that started this video, Tucker Carlson says that the government has admitted chemtrails are real, and they're calling it geoengineering. Truthfully, I think he knows exactly what he's doing. The statement is just wrong enough to engagement bait, while referencing something just real enough and commonly misunderstood to seem credible. Geoengineering is a serious, funded, and continually researched scientific effort to figure out whether we could intentionally put aerosols, which are small reflective particles, into the atmosphere to cool the planet. And the actual name of this technique is called stratospheric aerosol injection. There's really no secret here. It's not happening through some commercial airline that the patent from before might have scared people into thinking. But there are definitely concerns around this idea of injecting aerosols into the stratosphere. Beyond atmospheric questions like what specifically happens to the chemistry of the atmosphere, we have questions like who has power over injections and who controls them? If one nation just starts injecting on their own, but they hurt another nation, what happens? Will there be wars and global conflicts? What would happen if we brought down global temperatures and then stopped injecting aerosols? Would we see massive ecological disaster? These questions regarding something that could really truly be a strategy the world uses in the future to combat climate change, I think are much more worth our attention and skepticism, rather than worrying about the chemtrail conversation, which has no physical or scientific backing. I know this because it's actually what I research in university, and I want to get more into that, but that's for a whole other video. For now, I want to thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed.